The Montana Territory in the winter of '88 was no place for a soul to be alone. It was a land of frozen earth and promises just as cold. But for one woman shivering beside the ice-choked Yellowstone River, being alone was the least of her fears. She had just brought a new life into a world determined to snuff it out. Her only warmth, a threadbare blanket, and the fading memory of a man who had left her with nothing but a name he'd stolen. She didn't know it yet, but a lone rider drawn by a sound he mistook for a dying coyote was about to shatter her solitude. What he found under that merciless moonlight would unravel a storm of secrets, lies, and blood that would stain the snow for miles around. The cold was a physical thing, a predator with teeth of ice that bit deep into Celine's bones. It wasn't the creeping chill of a winter's night. It was an invasive absolute cold that threatened to crystallize the very marrow within her. Each breath she exhaled was a white ghost in the moonlight, a fleeting testament to the life that was flickering low within her. The Yellowstone River. A torrent of life in the summer was now a silent, armored beast beside her, its surface a jagged expanse of gray ice under the indifferent gaze of a billion stars. She lay beneath the sparse cover of a skeletal cottonwood, its bare branches clawing at the night sky. The pain, a white-hot tint that had consumed her for hours, had finally receded, leaving behind an exhausted, hollow ache. In its place was a new, terrifying reality cradled in her arms. A baby. A tiny, red-faced scrap of humanity, wrapped in the only spare garment she possessed, her late husband's woolen shirt. The child, a boy, was terrifyingly quiet. His small chest rose and fell in shallow, hitched breaths, and Celine pressed him against her own body, a desperate, futile attempt to share a warmth she no longer possessed. Her name was Celine Miller, or so she had told the people in the last town. It was a simple, forgettable name. Her real name was a secret she guarded more fiercely than the last of her stale biscuits. She was a widow, that much was true. But the story she told of a loving husband, a homesteader taken by pneumonia, was a carefully constructed fiction. The truth was far uglier, a brand on her soul that had driven her into this unforgiving wilderness. A whimper thin and fragile as a spider's thread escaped the bundle in her arms. "Shh, little one." Celine whispered her own voice, a dry rasp. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. "Shh now, Joseph. Mama's here." She had named him Joseph. It was a good, strong name. A name untainted by his father's legacy. A legacy of smoke, gunfire, and a hangman's noose. She closed her eyes, the edges of her vision swimming with dark spots. This was it. This was the end of the road. Her flight from the past, her desperate scramble for a new beginning, had led her to this frozen grave. She had run out of money, out of food, out of hope. The wagon had lost a wheel 2 days ago. The axle split clean through. She had taken what little she could carry and walked, hoping to reach the distant lights of a settlement before the baby came. She had failed. The world began to tilt, the brilliant moon blurring into a smear of cold light. She thought of her husband, Elias, not the man the world knew as the outlaw, Blackjack Corrigan, but the charming rogue who had courted her with stolen wildflowers and promises of a life in California, a life away from the blood and the bounties. He had been a liar, a thief, and a killer. But he had been her liar. And now he was dead, strung up in Cheyenne, and his legacy was a shivering babe in her arms and a price on both their heads. Not a public bounty, but a private one. A vengeful one. It was a sound that pulled her back from the edge of oblivion. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of a horse's hooves muffled by the snow. It was slow, steady, and getting closer. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her exhaustion. It wasn't the law. The law wouldn't be this quiet. It was someone else. A drifter, an outlaw, or worse, one of his men. The men Elias had betrayed. The men who believed she knew the location of his hidden fortune. She fumbled inside her worn coat, her numb fingers closing around the cold, hard steel of a small Remington Derringer. It was a pathetic defense, 2 shots against the vast, dark wilderness. But it was all she had. She held the baby tighter, trying to shield him with her body, and peered into the darkness. He emerged from the shadows like a spirit of the winter itself. A lone rider on a big, dark horse that snorted clouds of steam into the frigid air. He was a silhouette at first, a tall man in a long duster, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He stopped his horse 20 yards away, a statue of cautious observation. "Ma'am." His voice cut through the silence. It was a low baritone, rough-edged like shale, but not unkind. It carried a weariness that seemed to match the landscape. Celine said nothing. She didn't have the strength to shout, and a whisper would be lost to the wind. She could only watch her heart hammering against her ribs, her thumb on the Derringer's hammer. The man dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. He didn't reach for his hip. Instead, he raised his hands slightly, showing they were empty. "I heard a cry," he said, taking a slow step forward. Sounded like a critter caught in a trap. Didn't figure on it being this. He took another step, and the moonlight finally caught his face. It was a hard face, etched with lines that spoke of sun and sorrow. A thick, dark moustache covered his upper lip, and his eyes, deep-set and shadowed, held a profound sadness. He wasn't young, maybe 40. He looked tired of the world, but not yet defeated by it. "You alone, ma'am?" he asked, his gaze flicking from her to the bundle in her arms. Celine finally found her voice, a broken whisper. "Please, don't." He stopped, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Don't what, ma'am? You're half frozen. And is that a baby?" The word hung in the air, a stark absurdity in this place of death. The man's weary expression shifted, replaced by something akin to shock, then a dawning horror at the reality of the situation. "Sweet Mother of God," he breathed, taking another step. His caution forgotten. "How long have you been out here?" 2 days, she rasped. The baby. He came tonight. The man cursed under his breath, a sharp, angry sound directed not at her, but at the cruelty of the world. He moved with a new urgency, striding forward and kneeling in the snow beside her. He shrugged off his heavy duster, the sheepskin lining, still holding the warmth of his body. Here he said, his voice softer now, yet firm with command. He wrapped the coat around her, and the baby a cocoon of blessed heat. The scent of wood smoke, leather, and man filled her senses, an overwhelmingly vital smell after so long, with only the scent of ice and fear. "We need to get you warm." "Now," he stated. He looked around, his eyes assessing the bleak landscape. "My cabin ain't far. A mile, maybe less." He looked at her. Truly looked at her, and his gaze was steady. "My name is Holden Stratton. I mean you no harm." But if we stay here, that child won't see the dawn. You neither." Selina looked into his eyes, searching for deceit, for the glint of avarice or cruelty she had come to expect from men. She saw none. She saw only a reflection of her own exhaustion, a deep-seated ache with the state of things. In this frozen hell, he was the only chance she had. Trusting him was a gamble, but not trusting him was a certainty of death. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Without another word, Holden moved with practiced efficiency. He scooped her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. The sudden movement, the strength of his hold, sent a wave of dizziness through her, but she clung to him, her face buried in the rough wool of his shirt, the precious bundle of her son held tight between them. "Easy now," he murmured as he carried her towards his horse. "I've got you. I've got you both." As he lifted her onto the saddle and mounted behind her, cradling her and the child against his chest, Celine allowed a sliver of hope to pierce through her despair. Perhaps this stranger, this Holden Stratton, was what he appeared to be, a lifeline. But as the horse began its steady trek through the snow, a new fear began to creep in. She had escaped the frozen river, but she might have just walked into a different kind of trap entirely. A cabin was shelter, but it was also 4 walls. And for a woman with a secret as deadly as hers, 4 walls could become a cage just as easily as a sanctuary. The cabin was little more than a dark smudge against the snow-laden pines when they first saw it. But as they drew closer, a thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney promised a haven from the biting wind. It was a small, solid-looking structure of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss, with a single window that glowed with a faint, welcoming light from the banked embers within. It looked like the home of a man who wanted to be left alone, a fortress of solitude. Holden dismounted, and with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged exterior, helped Celine down. Her legs, numb and useless, buckled beneath her. But he held her fast, his arm a steel band around her waist. He kicked the door open and guided her inside. The warmth hit her first, a dry, enveloping heat that made her skin tingle and her frozen limbs ache in protest. The single room was Spartan but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a bedroll neatly tucked into a corner, a simple table and 2 chairs in the center. Shelves lined with tins of food books and neatly stacked firewood spoke of a man who was prepared, who had carved out a small, orderly existence in the midst of chaos. There was a faint scent of brewing coffee and pine sap. It was the smell of life. "Get you by the fire," Holden commanded softly, leading her to one of the chairs. He stoked the embers, adding fresh logs, until a cheerful blaze roared to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He then turned his attention to her, his expression grimly focused. "The baby," he said. "Let me see." Selina hesitated, clutching Joseph to her chest. Her instincts screamed at her not to let go, not to trust this strange man with her entire world. But one look at Joseph's pale face and the bluish tint to his tiny lips told her she had no choice. She slowly, reluctantly unwrapped the blood-stiffened shirt and revealed to the child. Holden knelt, his large, calloused hands surprisingly deft as he examined the infant. He touched the baby's foot, his brow furrowed in concentration. "He's cold. Too cold. We need to warm him slowly." He moved to a chest at the foot of his bed and pulled out a clean, soft flannel shirt and a small wooden basin. He filled the basin with warm water from a kettle hanging over the fire, testing it carefully with his finger. "We need to get these wet things off him," he said, his voice low and steady, as if he'd done this 100 times. He worked with a quiet competence, unwrapping the child from his damp rags. Celine watched a knot of anxiety in her stomach as this stranger handled her newborn son. He cleaned the baby with the warm water and the soft cloth, his movements efficient and tender. He wrapped Joseph in the warm, dry flannel and handed him back to Celine. "Keep him close to your skin," he instructed. "Your warmth is best." He then turned his attention to her. "You need to get out of those clothes, too. They'll kill you." He gestured to a thick woolen blanket on his bed. "Wrap yourself in that. I'll turn my back." There was no room for modesty. Shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering. Celine did as she was told, her fumbling fingers struggling with the frozen buttons of her dress. She wrapped the blanket around her shivering frame, huddling as close to the fire as she dared. Holden, true to his word, kept his back to her, busying himself with making a broth on the fire. The silence in the small cabin was thick, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the soft sounds of the baby's breathing, which was already sounding stronger. Why Celine finally asked, her voice still a hoarse whisper. "Why are you helping me?" Holden didn't turn around. He stirred the pot. His shoulders slumped slightly. No person deserves to die like that, especially not a child. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, yet held a weight of conviction. "Drink this," he said, handing her a steaming mug of broth. It was thin, but it was hot, and the salty flavor exploded on her tongue, the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. He settled into the other chair, nursing a cup of coffee, his eyes fixed on the fire. He seemed to be wrestling with his own thoughts. "My wife." "Mary," he said. After a long silence, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it. We had a daughter, a little girl named Clara." He stared into the flames as if seeing a ghost. "She would have been 6 this winter. There was a fever. It took them both. There was nothing I could do. Just had to watch." He fell silent again, and Celine understood. His help wasn't just charity. It was an act of penance, a balm for a wound that would never fully heal. She saw him now not as a potential threat, but as a man shattered by a grief as profound as her own. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and the words were wholly inadequate. He just nodded, taking a long swallow of his coffee. "Get some rest. You can have the bed." For the first time in months, Celine slept. It was a deep, dreamless sleep, born of sheer exhaustion in the relative safety of Holden Stratton's bed, her son warm and breathing steadily against her chest. The next few days passed in a blur of warmth and quiet care. Holden was a constant, unobtrusive presence. He hunted for game, chopped wood, and kept the fire roaring. He would leave fresh stew and bread on the table for her, never pressing her for conversation, never asking questions. He gave her space, treating her with a respectful distance that she was profoundly grateful for. He spoke little of himself, and she offered even less about her own past, clinging to her story of being the widow of a homesteader from down south. They were 2 solitary planets, orbiting the same small sun of the cabin's hearth, their paths parallel, but never quite touching. The baby Joseph began to thrive. His cheeks gained a healthy pink hue. His cries grew stronger, and he began to nurse with a fierce hunger. Watching him, Celine felt a fierce primal love that was so powerful it frightened her. He was all she had left of Elias, the good part, the promise of a new beginning. And she would do anything, lie, steal, kill to protect him. About a week after her arrival, their fragile peace was disturbed. A knock came at the door, loud and insistent. Celine, who was nursing Joseph by the fire, froze. Holden, who had been cleaning his Winchester rifle at the table, stood up slowly, his movements fluid and cautious. He motioned for her to be quiet, his eyes hard. He opened the door a crack, his body blocking the view. Outside stood a man, who looked as though he had been carved from the mountain itself. He was old, with a wild, grizzled beard that reached his chest and eyes that were a startlingly bright blue in his weathered face. He was wrapped in furs and carried a long rifle. Holden, the old man, grunted, his voice like gravel grinding together. Saw the extra smoke. Figured either your chimney was clogged or you finally got yourself some company. Holden relaxed slightly. Jebediah. What do you want? The old trapper. Jebediah. Cain craned his neck, trying to peer into the cabin. Just checking on my neighbor. It's a hard winter. Heard a rumor down in Redemption. Talk of a big bounty being offered by some fancy-dressed fella. Looking for an outlaw's woman. Celine's blood ran cold. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, and Joseph, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Jebediah's gaze finally landed on her. His bright eyes narrowed with suspicion and a flicker of recognition. Well now, what have we here? He looked from Celine to the bundle in her arms, then back to Holden. Company indeed. Didn't take you for the family man type, Stratton. She was in trouble. I helped her. Holden said, his voice low and dangerous, a clear warning. Jebediah held up his hands in a gesture of peace, though his eyes remained sharp. No concern of mine. Just making conversation. He looked Celine up and down one last time. You be careful, folks. That bounty hunter fella named Thorne, he ain't the kind to give up easy. He's paying top dollar for any word on a woman traveling alone with a newborn child. The old trapper tipped his hat. Happy wintering to you, he said, a sly grin spreading across his face. He then turned and trudged away, disappearing back into the trees. Holden closed the door, the heavy thud echoing the sudden dread in the room. He turned to face Celine, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held a new questioning light. The fragile truce was over. The outside world with its bounties and its hunters had found them. An outlaw's woman. Holden repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. With a newborn child. Seems like a mighty big coincidence, wouldn't you say? Mrs. Miller. The name he used, her false name, hung in the air between them like an accusation. The sanctuary had become a courtroom, and Selina knew she was on trial for her life and the life of her son. The lie had run its course, and the truth in all its terrible glory was about to be laid bare. The town of Redemption was a scar on the pristine white landscape, a jumble of false-fronted buildings huddled together for warmth against the encroaching wilderness. Its name was a bitter irony, for it was a place where men came to lose their souls, not to find them. The Gilded Cage Saloon was its beating, corrupted heart, a place of cheap whiskey, desperate men, and fleeting pleasures. It was here that Bartholomew Barth Thorne conducted his business. He was a stark contrast to the saloon's usual clientele of dusty cowboys, boisterous miners, and surly trappers. Thorne was impeccably dressed in a tailored black suit, his waistcoat a subtle grey silk, his boots polished to a mirror shine despite the muddy, snow-melted streets. He sat at a corner table nursing a glass of bourbon, his posture ramrod straight. He wasn't a large man, but he possessed an unnerving stillness, an aura of coiled lethality that made even the drunkest patrons give his table a wide berth. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, missed nothing. He had been in redemption for 3 days, a patient predator gathering the scent of his prey. He didn't ask questions like a common bounty man, shouting his quarry's name to the rafters. His methods were more refined, more insidious. He listened. He bought drinks for gossips. He paid the stable boy, a lad named Timmy, a whole silver dollar to recall any strangers who had passed through in the last month. There was a woman, Timmy had said, his eyes wide with the fortune in his palm. A few weeks back, she had a wagon with a busted axle. Bought a few supplies from Mr. Abernathy at the general store. Said her name was Miller. A widow. She was in a family way, sir. Very much so. Thorne had allowed himself a small, cold smile. And where did she go, my boy? Don't know, sir, the boy stammered. She headed north, out toward the Yellowstone. Mr. Abernathy told her she was a fool to go that way, with winter setting in and all. But she was determined. North. Towards the empty, unforgiving quarter of the territory. It was exactly the sort of desperate move he would expect from Celine Jane Corrigan. He knew her. Not personally, but he had studied her just as he had studied her late husband, the infamous Blackjack Corrigan. Blackjack was a brute, a creature of impulse and violence. But his wife Thorne had surmised was different. The daughter of a preacher swept up in a whirlwind romance with a handsome devil. She was clever, resourceful. She wouldn't make it easy. And she had something he wanted. Something more valuable than the private bounty placed by Elias Corrigan's betrayed partners. Corrigan's former gang, led by a ruthless man named Cyrus Kane, wanted Celine and the child for revenge. They believed she had betrayed Elias to the law, and they wanted the location of the gang's stolen fortune, a small chest of Union gold from a train robbery, a prize that had torn the gang apart. They had offered Thorne $10,000 for her and the babe alive. But Thorne had his own agenda. He knew something Cyrus Kane didn't. Blackjack Corrigan, for all his savagery, was a meticulous planner. Before his final fatal job, he had sent a letter to a trusted associate. A letter Thorne had intercepted. It spoke not of maps or buried treasure, but of something far more valuable and portable, a set of engraved printing plates for counterfeit $50 bills. Plates so perfect they were virtually indistinguishable from the real thing. The letter hinted that the key to their location, a complex cipher, was hidden with the one person he trusted, his wife, Celine. The baby he suspected was just a complication. The plates were the real prize. His quiet contemplation was interrupted by the saloon doors, swinging open, admitting Jebediah Kane, and a blast of cold air. The old trapper stomped the snow from his boots and made a beeline for the bar, ordering a whiskey. Thorne watched him. He had seen the trapper before, knew he lived somewhere out in the wilderness north of town. An isolated man. An observant man. Thorne waited until Jebediah had his second whiskey. Then he rose and approached the bar, placing himself next to the old man. A cold winter. Thorne said, his voice smooth as polished stone. Jebediah grunted, eyeing the fancy suit. It is that. A man could die out there if he's not careful. Or if he's alone. Thorne signaled the bartender. Another for my friend here. I am looking for someone. I was told you live out north of here. Perhaps you've seen a stranger." Jebediah took the offered whiskey, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Depends. Who might you be looking for?" "A woman," Thorne said, keeping his voice casual. "Traveling alone? A recent widow?" By now, she would have a newborn child with her. Jebediah's face remained a stony mask. But Thorne, a master at reading men, caught the flicker in his eyes, the almost imperceptible tensing of his shoulders. The trapper had seen her. Can't say I have Jebediah lied, turning back to his drink. Lots of folks passing through. Thorne smiled a thin, humorless expression. This woman is important. She is the widow of a very dangerous man. There are unresolved business matters. There is a reward, a substantial one. $500 for information leading to her whereabouts. Jebediah's hand paused on its way to his glass. $500. That was more money than the trapper saw in 2 years of selling pelts. It was enough to buy a small plot of land to escape the brutal winters. The old man's mind was working, weighing loyalty to a neighbor against a life-changing sum. "What's her name, Jebediah?" asked his voice a low growl. She might call herself Miller, Thorne said, watching him intently. But her real name is Corrigan. Celine Jane Corrigan. The name landed with the force of a physical blow. Jebediah's mask of indifference finally cracked. He knew the name Corrigan. The whole territory knew it. Blackjack Corrigan had been a terror, his name whispered in saloons and homesteads alike. And his woman was holed up just a mile from his own trapping line under the protection of Holden Stratton. Jebediah finished his whiskey in one gulp, slamming the glass down on the bar. "Never heard of her," he rasped, and without another word, he turned and stalked out of the saloon. Thorne watched him go, a triumphant gleam in his eye. The lie was too quick, the denial too forceful. The old man knew, and now Thorne knew where to start looking. Jebediah's trail in the snow would be easy enough to follow. It would lead him to his cabin, and from there, the trapper's frequent paths would eventually lead him to his neighbor, the neighbor who was sheltering a woman and a newborn. He returned to his table and finished his bourbon. The hunt was nearing its end. He would give the trapper a day's head start. Let him return to his wilderness den stew in his conflict. Let the fear and the greed do their work. Then he and his 2 hired men, the brutish Grady brothers he'd picked up in Cheyenne, would pay Mr. Jebediah Kane a visit, and the old man would talk. Oh, he would talk. Back in the cabin, the air was thick with unspoken accusations. Holden stood by the closed door, his body radiating a tense energy. He had faced down armed men, stared into the eyes of killers. But the trembling woman before him, with her wide, frightened eyes and the infant clutched to her breast, presented a different kind of challenge. Corrigan Holden repeated the name, his voice low and devoid of its earlier warmth. Jebediah mentioned a bounty on an outlaw's woman. Blackjack Corrigan's woman. Celine flinched as if he had struck her. The name spoken aloud in this small sanctuary felt like a desecration. She looked at Holden, at his hard, unyielding face, and knew the time for lies was over. Her carefully constructed world was collapsing. "My name is Celine Jane Miller." She began, her voice trembling. "That is my birth name. Corrigan, that was his. Blackjack. Corrigan was your husband." Holden pressed, taking a step closer. The room seemed to shrink, the roaring fire, suddenly oppressive. Celine could only nod, tears welling in her eyes. His name was Elias when I met him. He was a ranch hand or so, he said. He was charming. Kind. I didn't know about the rest. Not at first. But you found out. It wasn't a question. Yes, she whispered, shame and defiance warring in her voice. I found out. I tried to leave, but I loved him, and I was already carrying his child. I thought I could change him. I thought our son would change him. She let out a bitter, heartbroken laugh. I was a fool. What does this bounty hunter want with you? Holden demanded. This man, Thorne Elias. He was part of a gang, Celine explained the story, tumbling out of her in a rush. They robbed a Union train. But Elias betrayed them. He took the gang's share of the gold and hid it. He was caught for another crime and hanged before he could tell them where it was. His old partners, a man named Cyrus Kane. They think I know where the gold is hidden. They hired Thorne to find me. She looked down at the sleeping face of her son. They want the gold, and they want him, she said, her voice dropping to a near inaudible whisper, to erase Corrigan's line for good. Holden was silent for a long time, his face a mask of stone. He paced the length of the small cabin, his boots thudding softly on the wooden floor. He was a man who had built a life out of solitude, a life free from the complications and violence of other people's lives. And now a storm had walked through his door and was threatening to tear his carefully constructed peace to shreds. He had brought this upon himself. His one act of compassion had entangled him in the affairs of a dead outlaw and a ruthless bounty hunter. He stopped pacing and looked at her. His eyes filled with a weary resignation. The gold, he said. Do you know where it is? No, Celine said, meeting his gaze without flinching. I swear on my son's life, I have no idea. Elias never told me. It was his world, not mine. I wanted no part of it. Holden studied her face, searching for the lie. He saw only fear, exhaustion, and a fierce protective love for her child. He saw the truth. And he saw something else, a reflection of himself, a person trying to escape a past that refused to let go. His own past was not so different. He hadn't been an outlaw, but a lawman, a marshal in a boom town that had chewed up and spat out good men. He had seen too much violence, had been forced to commit too much of it himself. After Mary and Clara had died, the badge felt like a lead weight on his soul. He had walked away, seeking a place where the ghosts couldn't find him. He had been wrong. The ghosts were everywhere. This man, Thorne Holden, said, his voice now grimly practical. Jebediah said he was in redemption. That's too close. He'll find the old trapper. And Jebediah, for all his bluster, is not a brave man. For $500, he'll sell us out in a heartbeat. The stark reality of his words chilled Celine to the bone. What are we going to do? Holden walked to the window, peering out into the vast, indifferent wilderness. The sun was beginning to set, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple. It was beautiful, but it held no comfort. It was the beauty of a predator. We can't run, he said more to himself than to her. Not with a newborn, not in this weather. Thorne will be on us before we get 5 miles. And this cabin, it's a good defensive position, but we're outnumbered. He'll have men. He turned back from the window, and Selina saw a change in him. The weary sadness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, hard focus she hadn't seen before. It was the look of a man who had accepted the inevitable and was preparing for it. It was the look of the lawman he used to be. "There's only one thing to do," Holden Stratton said, his voice resonating with grim finality. "We make our stand here. We don't wait for the storm to break. We prepare for it. And when it comes, we meet it head on." He looked at Celine, and for the first time he saw her not as a victim, but as a fellow survivor. "The question is, Mrs. Corrigan, are you ready to fight?" Celine looked down at the innocent child in her arms, then back up at Holden. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a diamond-hard layer of resolve. She had been running for too long. There was nowhere left to run. "My name is Celine Miller," she said, her voice steady and clear. "And I've been fighting since the day I met him. I don't intend to stop now." Holden gave a single sharp nod. The fragile alliance born of pity and desperation was now forged into something stronger. It was a partnership cemented by a shared threat and the primal need to survive. The shadow of the past had found them, and the siege was about to begin. The 2 days that followed were a tense, quiet flurry of preparation. The fragile domesticity of the cabin vanished, replaced by the grim atmosphere of a fort bracing for an attack. The air grew thick with the smell of gun oil and nervous energy. Holden moved with a focused, methodical calm that both reassured and terrified Celine. This was a version of him she hadn't seen before, not the grieving recluse or the compassionate stranger, but a seasoned tactician preparing for war. He barred the single window with thick wooden planks, leaving only a narrow slit for observation and firing. He reinforced the door with an iron brace he forged in the fireplace. He loaded every weapon he owned, his Winchester .73, a Colt Peacemaker, and an old heavy buffalo gun that he propped against the wall. He even handed Celine her own Derringer back after cleaning and loading it himself. "It's not much," he said, his voice flat. "But if they get inside, aim for the face. Don't hesitate." Celine took the small pistol, its weight feeling both pathetic and profound in her hand. She watched Holden, his movements economical and precise, and realized the life of quiet solitude he had built was a lie. A thin veneer over a core of hard-won, violent experience. "You were a lawman, weren't you?" she asked, the question hanging in the charged silence. Holden paused, his hands stilling on the rifle he was wiping down. He didn't look at her. A long time ago, in a town full of ghosts. He said nothing more, and she didn't press. His past was his own, but his skills belonged to them both now. He instructed her on her role. She was to stay low, away from the door and the window, and keep Joseph quiet. He set up a small redoubt for her in the corner behind the overturned heavy oak table, piling furs and blankets inside it. It was a pathetic fortress, but it was something. The waiting was the worst part. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching footsteps. Every snap of a branch in the woods was the sound of a rifle being cocked. The silence stretched for hours, tightening their nerves like overwound clock springs. During the day, the bright, unforgiving sun on the snow felt like a spotlight exposing them. At night, the darkness was a suffocating blanket full of unseen threats. On the morning of the 3rd day, it happened. Holden was peering through the slit in the window shutter, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hand. "They're here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Celine's heart leaped into her throat. She scrambled behind the table, pulling a sleeping Joseph tightly against her. She risked a glance over the tabletop. Through the narrow opening, she could see 3 figures on horseback emerging from the tree line. They were black silhouettes against the blinding white snow. Even from a distance, one man stood out. He sat taller in the saddle, his posture radiating an unshakable confidence. Bath Thorn. The other 2 hulking figures on either side of him were undoubtedly the Grady brothers. They stopped about 100 yards from the cabin, a clear and present threat. Mrs. Corrigan Thorne's voice sliced through the cold morning air, amplified by the silence. It was cultured, calm, and utterly chilling. "I know you are in there. I have no quarrel with Mr. Stratton. Send out the woman and the child, and he can walk away from this with his life intact." Holden didn't answer. He raised the Winchester to his shoulder, its long barrel resting steadily on the windowsill. Stratton Thorne shouted again, a hint of impatience creeping into his tone. "You are harboring a fugitive, the wife of a murderer and a thief. This is not your fight. Do not die for a lie." Inside the cabin, Holden finally spoke his voice, a low growl directed at Celine. "He's trying to divide us. Don't listen." "I'm not," she whispered, her knuckles white as she gripped the tiny derringer. Outside, Thorne waited a moment more. When no reply came, he gave a curt nod to the men beside him. The Grady brothers dismounted, unstrapping rifles from their saddles. "A foolish choice," Thorne yelled, and the world exploded in a cacophony of gunfire. A bullet slammed into the log wall next to the window, showering Holden with splinters. He didn't flinch, his eye still sighted down the barrel of his rifle. He squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked against his shoulder, its report deafening in the small room. Outside, one of the Grady brothers grunted and staggered back, clutching his shoulder, his rifle falling into the snow. One down. Holden muttered, already working the lever action, chambering a new round. The remaining Grady brother and Thorne scattered, taking cover behind the thick trunks of the pine trees. The siege had truly begun. For the next hour, a deadly exchange played out. Bullets thudded into the cabin's log walls, some punching clean through to embed themselves in the opposite wall. Celine made herself as small as possible, shielding Joseph with her body as he began to wail his cries, a heart-breaking counterpoint to the roar of the guns. Holden was a rock. He moved between the window slit and small chinks in the walls he'd prepared, never firing wildly, always making each shot count. He was patient, deadly, and completely focused. He was fighting for more than just his life. He was defending the small pocket of peace he had lost once before and had, against all odds, found again. Then a new sound, a crashing noise from the back of the cabin. The Gradys were using a fallen log as a battering ram against the back wall, which was weaker than the front. "They're coming through the back!" Celine cried out. "Stay put!" Holden ordered, his face grim. He fired 2 quick shots towards the trees to keep Thorne pinned down, then moved to the rear of the cabin, the heavy buffalo gun now in his hands. The wood of the back wall began to splinter and crack. With a final mighty heave, the logs gave way, and the wounded Grady brother stumbled through the opening, a wild look in his eyes. Holden was waiting. The buffalo gun roared, a cataclysmic boom that shook the entire cabin. The big bore slug hit the outlaw square in the chest, lifting him off his feet and throwing him back out into the snow, a lifeless heap. But the distraction had cost them. As Holden dealt with the brother, the front door burst open. Thorne stood there, a revolver in each hand, his face a mask of cold fury. He fired instantly. Holden cried out, not in pain, but in surprise, as a bullet grazed his temple, sending him stumbling backward. His vision swam. Thorn stepped into the cabin, his eyes scanning the room, landing on Celine, huddled behind the table. A cruel smile touched his lips. "There you are, my dear. The grieving widow." He took a step towards her, raising his pistol. Celine stared down the barrel, her mind blank with terror. Joseph, sensing her fear, screamed louder. Suddenly a shot rang out, but it wasn't from Thorn's gun. It came from outside. Thorn grunted in man, a red stain blossoming on his right shoulder. His gun hand dropped the revolver, clattering to the floor. He spun around in disbelief. Standing at the edge of the clearing, a smoking, long rifle in his hands, was Jebediah Kane. The old trapper's face was set in a grim, determined line. His conscience, or perhaps his dislike for fancy-suited men, telling him what to do, had won out over his greed. "Get away from 'em, Thorn," Jebediah growled, his voice carrying across the snow. "This is neighborly business. You ain't welcome." Thorn, snarling with rage and pain, turned his remaining pistol towards the old trapper. But the momentary distraction was all Holden needed. Shaking his head to clear it, he lunged not for a gun, but for Thorn himself. He tackled the bounty hunter with the force of a grizzly, sending them both crashing onto the floor. It was no longer a gunfight. It was a desperate, brutal brawl. They rolled across the floorboards, grunting and cursing. Thorn was wiry and quick, landing sharp, painful blows. But Holden was stronger, fueled by a righteous fury. He slammed Thorn's head against the floor, twice. The bounty hunter went limp. Holden rose, breathing heavily, blood trickling down the side of his face. He stood over the unconscious form of Barth Thorn, his chest heaving. The silence that fell was more profound than the noise it replaced, broken only by Joseph's exhausted sobs and the wind whistling through the new holes in the cabin walls. Jebediah walked slowly into the cabin, his rifle held ready. He looked at the carnage, at the dead man in the snow, at the unconscious bounty hunter, and then at Holden. "Figured you could use a hand," the old trapper said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the floor. "Couldn't let a man like that win. It ain't right." Holden just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of a debt that could never be repaid. He looked over at Celine, who was slowly emerging from behind the table, her face pale, but her eyes fierce. Their gazes met over the wreckage of the battle, a silent understanding passing between them. They had survived. Together. The siege was over, but the reckoning was yet to come. The aftermath of the violence was a stark, quiet tableau. The air in the cabin was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. Outside, the pristine snow was marred by footprints, and Death, the body of the Grady brother, a dark stain on the otherwise perfect white. Holden, using rope from his stores, tied the still unconscious Barth Thorn to one of the chairs. He worked with a grim efficiency, his movements sure and steady, despite the gash on his temple, which Celine insisted on cleaning and bandaging with a strip of clean cloth. Her hands trembled as she tended to him, the reality of their shared ordeal settling upon her. Jebediah Kane stood by the doorway, his rifle cradled in his arms, watching the proceedings with his shrewd blue eyes. "What did you plan on doing with him?" he grunted, nodding towards Thorn. "Can't keep him here." "The law in redemption is a joke," Holden said, pulling the ropes tight. "Thorn probably has a dozen dodgers on the local sheriff. If we turn him in, he'll be out in a week and he'll come back." The unspoken alternative hung heavy in the air. A shallow grave in the woods beside the man he'd brought with him. It would be the easiest, safest solution. A final end to the threat. Selina looked at the bound man, at his pale, aristocratic face, now bruised and blooded. She thought of Elias, of the cycle of violence that had consumed her life and nearly taken her sons. Killing Thorn would make them no different from him. No, she said, her voice surprisingly firm. No more killing. Holden looked at her, then at Jebediah. The old trapper gave a slow nod of agreement. The woman's right. We ain't him. An hour later, Thorn began to stir. His eyes fluttered open, first with confusion, then with a dawning, hateful recognition. He tested his bonds, his face a mask of cold fury, when he found them secure. You should have killed me, Stratton, he hissed, his voice raspy. You'll regret this. Holden ignored him. He looked at Celine. He mentioned some plates, engraved plates. Not gold. Is that what this was about? Celine's eyes widened in understanding. Just before he was hanged, Elias had sent her a small, heavy package. It contained a book of children's rhymes, a strange gift. He had told her in a letter to read it to our son. It holds the key to his future. She had assumed it was a sentimental gesture. Now she understood. The key, the cipher. She retrieved the book from her meager belongings. He sent me this. He said it was important. Thorn's eyes locked onto the book, a greedy, feverish light entering them. The nursery rhymes. It's the cipher key. The plates. Where are they? Holden took the book from Celine. That's something you'll never know. He turned to the bounty hunter. Here's what's going to happen. Jebediah is going to take your remaining horse and ride to the next territory, to Fort Laramie. The army has a real marshal there. He's going to tell them that Barth Thorn, a wanted man in 3 states for murder and extortion, can be found here. He's also going to tell them about the counterfeiting plates. That should get their attention. Thorn's face went pale. A local sheriff could be bought. The U.S. Army marshals were a different breed entirely. It'll take him 3 days to get there, 3 days to get back. Holden continued, his voice cold as ice. Until then, you will be my guest. You will eat what I give you, and you will not speak unless spoken to. When they arrive, I will give them the book, and you. Your hunt is over, Thorn. With that, Jebediah left, taking Thorn's horse, and a silent promise to return. The days that followed were filled with a tense, oppressive silence. Thorn sat bound to his chair, emanating pure, impotent rage. Celine cared for Joseph, her every action a defiant statement of life in the face of the death that sat in their midst. Holden kept watch, his rifle never far from his hand. When the marshals finally arrived, a full posse of them, they were as serious and unyielding as Holden had predicted. They took Thorn the book and Holden's statement with grim professionalism. As they rode away with their prisoner, a profound sense of peace settled over the small cabin. The storm had passed. That evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the snow, Holden and Celine stood outside the cabin. The world felt quiet, clean, and new. "You can't stay here," Holden said softly. "Even with Thorn gone, his partners, this man, Kane. They'll still be looking." "I know," Celine said, pulling her blanket tighter. "We'll head west, to California maybe. A place big enough to get lost in. Start over. A new name, a new life." "We," Holden asked, turning to look at her. Celine met his gaze, her heart in her eyes. "Joseph and I couldn't ask you to." "You're not asking," he interrupted gently. He looked out at the vast, empty landscape that had been his refuge. It no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a prison. He thought of Mary and Clara, not with the sharp pain of fresh grief, but with a gentle melancholy acceptance. They were gone, but here, standing next to him, was a new life, a new beginning. A woman of incredible strength and a child who had survived against all odds. "I'm tired of being alone, Celine Holden." Stratton said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "There's nothing for me here but ghosts. Maybe we could head west together." Tears streamed down Celine's face, not of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming relief. She didn't offer words, just a single, heartfelt nod. In the fading light of the setting sun, two broken souls, a widow and a widower, found not a fairy tale ending, but something far more real and precious a chance. The road ahead would be long and fraught with uncertainty, but they would face it together, two solitary figures finding their way toward a shared dawn. The Wild West had taken everything from them, but in its harsh, unforgiving crucible, it had also given them a new, fragile hope to carry into the horizon. That's where our story ends, not with a final gunshot, but with a quiet promise under a vast western sky. It's a tale that proves that even in the harshest of lands, amidst the echoes of violence and the ghosts of the past, the most resilient thing that can grow is hope. The story of Celine Miller and Holden Stratton is a testament to the strength of the human spirit, a reminder that sometimes the family you choose is the one that saves you. If their journey through the frozen wilderness gripped you, if you felt the chill of the air and the warmth of their courage, then please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you want more tales from the untamed frontier. Share this video with someone who loves a story of survival and redemption. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that bell so you never miss another story where history's forgotten voices are brought back to life. Thank you for listening.